Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today's video is basically another Nova Q&A. Unlike the last one, which was a largely lore-based Q&A, where we talked about kind of it in more detail and answered some of the burning questions, to the extent that is, possible, whilst also keeping certain story details for the future under wraps. This is more specifically a behind-the-scenes Q&A, and as such, I'm going to be a lot freer to kind of discuss things a lot more openly. Now, in terms of design, I didn't do it, really. It was ultimately the work of JetFreak7 and Starfox. They are the guys who I went to, who agreed to remake the ship in a way that kind of I suggested. Ultimately, they were the ones doing it and had to, make it work. I was more just providing a general direction with various useful sayings, such as make it look sleeker, which, I will confess to saying that. So this video is basically going to be a Q&A session where people have asked questions about the new design, and I'm basically going to read out their responses. The reason we went for this is because ultimately we're living in 3 different time zones, and some of us don't speak English as our first language. So it's far easier to just do this as basically they've written down their answers ahead of time. I've given them the questions, and I'll read them out to you and then give my own thoughts. So without any further ado, I'll just get into it and sort of start going through questions. I'll go through their answers first and then give my thoughts on the matter, because my thoughts are often very tangential, shall we say. Okay, so the first question is this. What made you go with green at this stage? Are there any other colours you could share? Why do we think both in Next Generation and both Romulans and Klingons were in green? So JetFreak is the main person to go for that question because he did the texturing. So in terms of coloration, this is his answer. I wanted a transitional color from the sort of grey of TOS ships to the familiar dark green of the TNG warbirds. Rick Knox's original model had a clever sort of light green as an in-between scheme, so I used that as a reference point between the 2 eras. Now, in terms of that and the use of colour, this is now me personally speaking, we did try, in fact, JetFreak did create textures for a TOS style coloration, and in fact, actually, with the original Nova design, when it was featured in comics from like the 80s or 90s, but it was featured in comics, when it did, it was in that TOS style color scheme, white and orange. Now, for that Nova, it actually works quite well because it's a very simple shape and very simple design. So you can kind of get away with having white and orange. My finding was that with the new Nova that we had come out with, because we had talked about the white and orange as a possibility, but then upon kind of seeing it, I personally didn't feel like it worked. It's a subjective thing, to be sure. I think other people perhaps will like it. But for me, it was the shape is too complex to have in the sort of, light grey / white of TOS. It's far too complex to have in a bright colour. You want darker colours to kind of emphasise the depth. So that's kind of why we went for that. Now, we did also try another colour scheme, which you will be seeing in later episodes set during the 24th century, of a TNG era warbird, of a TNG era Nova, which is in dark green. This thing just looks evil as can be. It's excellent, and I think it just goes to show, if you have a ship that's filled with lots of very complex shapes and details and nooks and crannies, and I think dark colours generally help it kind of just gain more of an ominous, shadowy presence. So yeah, that's kind of why we ultimately stuck with green. It's ultimately a Romulan colour. yes, I'm not one of these people who would say that, oh, because TNG Romulans are green, TOS Romulans have to be green. I don't. I like that the TOS Romulan ships are in white. But the main reason that works for them is because their ships are very simple shapes. So you can, again, very much get away with it. You have basically a simple shape with a white and orange livery. The main detail is, of course, coming from the orange bird of prey. So that's really my feelings on the color. I think I've rambled enough on that. Next question. What was the reasoning behind each design change? The removal of the secondary nacelles, the changes to the prow, etc. So this probably more is in... So from Starfox, as far as changes to the hull goes, it was mainly a combination of modernization, as far as making the ship look more like the design aesthetic that the Romulans went with in canon. So it fits as a link between TOS and TNG. The biggest problem with FASA designs is that they basically abandoned the original series Romulan technology and sensibilities and instead made them look more unique, the same as, except a little more fragile and a little faster in the FASA game. So essentially, I would agree with that, is that, and I think I mentioned it in the announcement video for the Nova, and saying that it was going to be redesigned because FASA came out in this weird period where, you had Star Trek content and it was the universe was beginning to be sort of filled out, but they didn't 100% know what that would look like, and certainly not for the Romulans. And Jet Freak points out that, yes, very true, FASA designs had guesswork involved, and it was a weird time. So he says, Starfox continues, I wanted to restore that Romulan aesthetic, not just in the look, in the functionality of the ship. The Romulans at this point see themselves as underdogs in a big way, and they're going to use everything they can get their hands on, including the kitchen sink, and the Nova reflects that. It's got a little bit of everything, and I'm a big fan of form follows function. So we want to see all the weapons. They need to be up front and visible and in your face. That was definitely something that I was also behind personally. It just makes it easier to work out visually how many weapons the ship has, rather than, you get the scimitar problem where, it notionally has all these weapons, but they're not modelled on the ship. We also wanted, he now continues, we also wanted other parts of the ships to be more than just greebles. If you know your Star Trek starships, and you need to be able to look at everything and take at least an educated guess at what it does. The original design doesn't really have anything that says I'm a Romulan warship. Rick got around this by giving it a paint job that in many ways aesthetically calls up the next generation warbirds. The colours are in many ways transitional, I think informed by the look in old magazines. I'm showing my age for FASA here in this ad for the miniature FASA game. You are Starfox, because that was all well before I was born. The Wing Defender is painted up much in the same way, and it's textured in the Starfleet Command mods and in Star Trek Legacy. Wing Defender had that livery first, that brown, sort of green and brown, and then that was then applied. Rick and the other guys working on the FASA ships, basically took that one paint job and applied it to everything for the TMP era. So we start out with this faithful recreation of the FASA model with a paint job that does say Romulus. I decided to take the next step and give the ship visual cues and alter it to fit what we know of Romulan warfare. We know they like to do landings, planetary landings, so they need to give it big shuttle bays. We know that at this point, they're not ready to let go of their old-fashioned plasma torpedoes, and it also needs massive impulse engines. And then Jet Freak says, the final redesigned ship feels more unified overall, especially when the original FASA ship felt half-finished and at the front area was significantly lacking profile. Starfox then says, in a way, it is a baby scimitar. Now this is Jet Freak, reducing the greebles was a good move. It felt too much Star Wars for the Romulan aesthetic. Starfox saying that yes, it does look like an Imperial strike cruiser with warping nacelles on it. And that was so going to kind of my role when I basically presented this mad, insane picture to the guys and said, these are the things I want changed. So as you can see, there's one of my big, basically reds are things I just want gone. I want them gone. I either want to know what they are or I want it gone. So one of the big ones is unnecessary/ugly greebling on the underside. And that is it's a very stretched texture, makes the model feel very dated. From the top, it's kind of all right, although again, you look at the top side where you have that dark texture in place. And again, it doesn't really fit with Star Trek ships. Star Trek ships don't have this weird rough texturing. And I accept this is certainly not me, dunking on Rick Knox for what he did back in the day. It was very good starting point that he gave us. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of stuff that it's not necessarily clear what it is, and it just seems to be there for texturing's sake. You can see one of the other things I said was work out, clarify details. So again, emphasizing. So you've got a couple of things where I say, what are these? Remove. Now with that, it turns out that was actually the mechanism for the plasma torpedo launcher, but it wasn't clear. And one of the things Starfox did was remodel that, to fit better with the kind of the flow and shape of the ship, feel more organic and not just these external pods hanging off the side of the ship. But also then make it clear what it was by having sort of visual callbacks to the original plasma torpedo launcher. Other things were, for example, the shuttle bays. And it's a bit of a confused mess. What is that? Well, again, that gets clarified on the new model. You can see very clearly that it is shuttle bays. In fact, we end up with an additional shuttle bay because we end up adding additional underwings, which you might say is a bit soon because you're kind of, you're not at TNG yet, but you want to move towards that direction. And it's more that the nacelles felt the ship had a flat bottom. Ultimately, the ship ended up with a flat bottom, and that just wasn't nice to look at. Starships don't have flat bottoms. I can't think of any starship in Star Trek that has a flat underside. It's always got something going on. So for this to feel very sort of catamaran-ish, like a pontoon plane, it didn't really work. It didn't feel very dynamic or energetic. This just felt like a ship that would sort of just go along in straight lines, which is not how a Star Trek ship should feel. Other things, including the barbs on which the disruptors were mounted. Again, all he did there was just emphasize the details, show that there were disruptors on top, torpedo launchers underneath, and then actually adding a bit of a flare to the front nose so that shape forms up better. The wings were broadened, makes them feel stronger, gives it more presence. It also helped then, again, strengthen that feel in conjunction with the underslung wings as well. So, I mean, yeah, I think you can see within this picture here and then the final product, the approach that we ultimately took in terms of modernizing and redesigning the Nova class. Just how derivative of Klingon warp nacelles are those on the Nova and other features from older Romulan designs like the blade-shaped ones from the 22nd century Warbird or the club-shaped ones from the Cabbage and Chowder classes and the Federation-style ones that Talis carried over and combined? Did any of these particular characteristics were any of these particular characteristics incorporated into the Nova's nacelles? So Starfox, again, is the main person to go to here. The big difference between Federation warp engines and Klingon warp engines is the Klingons use very powerful, compact coils. The Klingons are focused on using very compact coils, which help ease maintenance, whereas the Federation is using large, powerful coils to generate a powerful warp field that the ship can use the coils for long periods of time. So it's a quality So it's a quality thing. And the Romulans are already ahead of them both because they were using fusion-powered warp engines in order to achieve speeds that were moderately competitive with the Klingon ships of the day, and the Romulans needed more efficient warp coils. Now, there is a limit to that, but they did certainly have to push their coil technology to the limit to achieve speeds that I wouldn't necessarily say are particularly competitive, but they were good enough for their day. That's not to say competitive. I would say good enough. You look at something like the Thry. It's got a big reactor and big warp nacelles, and that's kind of what allows it to generate a reasonable amount of speed. Once they gained access to both matter-antimatter warp reactors and Klingon coil design, they're already materially efficient, and advanced manufacturing capacity were able to take this in directions to the Klingons only dreamed of. So, I mean, this does kind of bear into... Me and Starfox don't necessarily fully agree on the lore, because I would say that the nacelles are... They are Klingon. They take on certain Klingon DNA. There's a little bit of Klingon DNA, more in its orientation than anything else, actually. The Klingon nacelles are very low-slung, and relatively speaking, so are the Novas, which gives it a kind of similar profile to a Klingon battlecruiser at warp, although not quite, because you're leaning a bit further forward in the warp field. So, yeah, I have a lot of disagreements there. Essentially, for me, Romulan antimatter is it's a transitional system. They use it from the late 23rd century into the midpoint of the 24th century until they get warbirds, really as because they have to. I talk about the compression drive in the Nova episode, and it gets better, but it's still not the most efficient thing in the world compared to a dilithium operated drive. The main reason the Romulans get access to artificial quantum singularity is because of their use of the cloaking device and their experiments with gravitic manipulation, which ultimately comes from their use of fusion for so long. Because the Romulans were reliant on fusion energy for so long, they got very good at manipulating gravimetric fields, to crush matter together and create fusion reactions. Now, when that then comes to the 24th century, you've then been manipulating gravity in your engine, in your cloaking device, and you can bring that together to form an artificial quantum singularity. Now, sort of just getting back to the main point of this, which is less lore, but more aesthetic. Aesthetically, one of the big things I said for the engines is make them thinner. Because you have these big boxy pontoon feeling engines. I was not keen on those. So I said basically chop them in half, turn them into essentially cuboid nacelles, make them feel more rectangular. That then also kind of fits with Federation style nacelles. So maybe there's actually some technological... Yeah, actually looking at it, what we ultimately have here with the Nova nacelle is a combination of a Klingon philosophy, but with a Federation style of design, because the Nova is ultimately made for relatively long-range missions, for quite long-range missions, which Klingon battlecruisers aren't. Klingon battlecruisers are designed for immediate performance characteristics. So it makes sense that the Nova basically has this halfway house where it's got some of the ease of maintenance qualities that a Klingon system has, but also has the cruising power of a Federation warp nacelle. So I think that answers that question in a roundabout way. As you can see, me and Starfox have different views on the lore. His is much more informed by stuff like Klingon Academy. Yeah, so just one last question then. So this feeds into our next question. Who made the remade version, and will you do further work as a resurrector of Romulan space superiority? Starfox very humbly says that it was a collaborative effort, but there will be other Romulan ships. I feel that I've sat on long enough and need to get done while I'm still able. I can certainly answer. So you will you have seen at this point? Well, one that he has done, he's remade it just more sprucing up than anything else, was the Firehawk, which I will be featuring in the Tomed instance. So look out for that. I did already mention it in the Romulan Fleet Doctrine video, so go watch that. He is also remaking Romulan ships from Klingon Academy. I think he's doing an excellent job as well, actually. It's I'm not the biggest fan of the Klingon Academy style of design, which is, bigger, bulkier ships with more and more nacelles. I'm not that keen on it. But he is doing it in a way that is interesting. I wouldn't necessarily kind of accept it into my head canon, but I can appreciate what it is and the attempt to kind of bring these ships to life. So yes, and the Firehawk is definitely a very good example of that. It works very well, I think, particularly because of the Nova redesign. We did actually Starfox actually used Firehawk parts in the Nova rebuild, as you can see basically on the bridge section. Another kind of note of redesign is replacing the plasma accumulators, which actually looked like Duridex Warbird nacelles on the hull, and they were replaced with Klingon D7 nacelles. That was a suggestion by myself, as a way I was just thinking, they had the Stormbirds, but they're not using them anymore. Why don't they use those nacelles as fuel tanks? And again, it also serves as a connective, a point of connection between the Stormbird and the Nova. So that's the other thing I would say about this version of the Nova. It's not a complete break. And again, especially when you put it in with ships like the Stormbird and actually the Thry from Star Trek Online, which people love, and I'm in that club as well. Absolutely adore that ship. And actually giving it the secondary wings on the underside, that actually helps tie it together even more so. Otherwise you wouldn't necessarily see that relation. But because you have the Thry and then the Nova and then the Vamalak and then the Duridex, you can then see that lineage sort of emerging. So I think we did a very good job of making it distinct. I think the guys did a very good job of making it distinct and memorable and keeping its identity. I think we did a very good job of maintaining the core identity of the Nova without losing sight of what it ultimately is meant to be part of. It's meant to be part of this larger lineage. And again, I will say certain other designs which I am or I'm not a fan of. For example, I think is it the Raven class? Someone suggested the Raven class in a other Q&A, and it just doesn't fit as a lineage as its own ship. I mean, this is what you really get into with this era of Romulan design, and what this whole series has been about, kind of correcting or ameliorating, is this confused approach where you've got all these different people who are all throwing different ideas and aesthetics into the pot for what Romulan ships look like in this period. And I hope that we have successfully brought a vision which is, which works with what we end up seeing in TNG and also connects back to TOS and recognizes that, whilst also being very distinct and individual. I love having distinct eras of ships. That's another thing. I don't like making everything look like everything else. That's kind of why I was quite adamant to keep that brown and green color scheme for the Nova and not just jump to a TNG aesthetic, because it then keeps those Romulans. These are, this is a different period. It's a different time in the Empire. There's a different vibe about the place. And for me, particularly when I'm going back and, working with people on older ships from sort of, legacy eras, for me, it's very important to keep that that aesthetic and stay true to that and the spirit of the time. It's like making a TOS era defiant. And, you know, you can do so, and people have. And I appreciate the art for what it is, but it's, in terms of the spirit of TOS, I think it's missing the point to an extent. So yeah, that's really my my thoughts, and that's the thoughts of Starfox and Jet Freak. Thank you guys so much for your help on this project and additional stuff that you've helped me out with. Shout out to all the guys in the Armada modding community, into which I've been sort of inducted, and they've taken me in, and they've been absolutely delightful. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm so happy that you guys all seem to really like this redesign, and I do too. You know, it's one of those things that on one level, I sometimes think, oh, should I have made that decision? Should I have done this redesign? And then I look at it and it's like, no, but it does work. And I think that is also the benefit of having two people there who really know their stuff. They really know what they're about. And, you know, they were immensely helpful and excellent at, you know, being realistic with what was and wasn't possible. It's always good to have someone to answer to. And so it's been an absolute joy. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sure it was an interesting experience, me talking with other people's words. And now I shall thank my members, my Navarks, David Reeves, Jeffrey Ballard, and Tully DT. My commanders. Channel has been deleted. Miami Jules, Captain's Quarters, Chase Rector, PQSK, Philip Ty, Jeff Hallam, Bird Monster, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Sean Farrell, Gilmo Martinez, and Das Blas. And I salute my loyal Centurions, Nathaniel Mead, Pendlebury, BOS Domestic Disputes, Adam Bowman, Marcus Hall, Paul Lash, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, and Okokatum Questo. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.